And welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be discussing the topic of the Arab Spring, what happened back in 2011, and why I believe we're likely to see one quite soon, sort of renewal of uprisings across the Arab world. I guess a couple preliminary notes. It sort of seems almost obscene to be talking about anything else this morning other than the fact that Israel is attacking Rafah, taking, essentially the last refuge of the Palestinian population in Gaza. It's a horrific thing that is an ongoing story, but I think what we're doing today is providing valuable context that will sort of indicate why the Biden administration is doing some of the quite insane seeming things that it is doing, and to sort of give that broader context that I unfortunately don't believe the Israeli government or any of the surrounding governments are paying really any attention to, and it's about to probably blow up in all of our faces. So I think this is worth looking into. Can't say anything other than just to be horrified that the Israeli military is still carrying out their horrific extermination program 7 months later, and that they are now attacking Rafah despite the Biden administration telling them they couldn't. That's a whole nother kettle of worms that we will get to eventually. As a preliminary thing, if this is your first time here, what's going to happen is I'm going to spend the next half hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, it depends, there's a lot to get through today, going through this presentation. While I go through this presentation, I will not have the bandwidth to pay attention to the comments. That is not something I'll be able to focus on. We have a moderator, Logo Cool Extreme. He will let you know if you are breaking the guidelines. The guidelines are this: you are not allowed to attack anyone else in the chat. You can say anything you want about me, about my ideas, about my haircut, what have you. Go nuts. You're not allowed to attack other people in the chat. You're not allowed to disrupt the chat with repeated spamming. And especially on topics like these, we will accept genocidal language from nobody. So I don't want to see anybody attacking either Israelis or Palestinians with genocidal language. So that's not the kind of thing that's acceptable here. Loga is our moderator. He will warn you if you are acting out in a way that we don't like, and then he will, if you persist in that behavior, he will ban you for all time. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. Do what he says. If someone in the chat can say that I am coming through, okay, that would be good. Just let me know that I am coming through all right. And then I will launch into it. So there was a real oddity last week that, like many of the Biden administration's efforts in this direction, has blown up. The Abraham Accords, I think, permanently discredited in any thinking person's eyes on October 7th. This was the idea put forward by the Trump administration and then really doubled down on by the Biden administration, which was, okay, we're just going to get Israel to do deals with some of the worst governments in the world. We're going to get them to do deals with absolute monarchs. We're going to get them to do deals with, well, I guess they did have one quasi-democratic government in Sudan, which, as I warned at the time, had a serious risk of tipping that country over into civil war. That's what happened. That's, of course, not exclusively because of the deal they did with Israel, but it certainly didn't help. So the Abraham Accords, terrible, terrible idea. And the principle, the basic idea here was, let's just forget about the Palestinians. Let's just move on from the Palestinian problem. October 7th made it clear that Netanyahu did not maintain a decent enough security cordon to get away with that. And I think the basic question of the Abraham Accords, they were illegitimate for moral reasons. This idea that we're just going to abandon the Palestinians to a permanent state of subjugation, that was always immoral, but they were always fundamentally really stupid. And I think that's the part of it that we're going to talk about today, because they were placing extraordinary bets on some of the worst governments in the world. They were betting that the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, these kings, were going to be here 10, 15 years from now. If they're unlikely to be so, which I have said for, almost a decade at this point, it's incredibly unwise, leaving beside the morals, leaving aside the idiocy of this, the humiliation of the United States, a country founded on battling monarchy, entering into these sorts of deals with absolute monarchs. Leaving all that aside, it's just a dumb play for the United States and Israel because these governments are incredibly shaky. And we'll be talking about that. Saudi Arabia specifically, but also the United Arab Emirates, is nowhere near as, it has less danger from its people, but at the end of the day, it's just a tiny, nasty government in a neighborhood that can be hostile to it. So, the Abraham Accords, bad idea, should have been proven, but the Trump administration loved them, and the Biden administration has been trying desperately to keep these things going. And something happened last week that was really clarifying. Throughout the past 7 months of horror, despite the fact that most people in the Saudi government are saying there's no chance of this anymore without some kind of two-state solution, the Biden administration has been pushing and pushing. Brett McGurk, who we've talked about on the podcast, the loser who's been running the insanely bad U.S. Middle East foreign policy under Obama, Trump, and Biden. It's pushing. And last week we got a new level of ridiculousness. The way that this was sold to people in the United States and the U.S. foreign policy establishment is like, we're going to give Saudi Arabia these incredible things. We're going to give Saudi Arabia a NATO-style security guarantee, something that the United States has not given out to anybody since the 1950s. And we're going to allow them, this is kind of extraordinary for Saudi Arabia, the country most responsible for 9/11, we're going to allow them access to nuclear technology without the hoops that we make like the UAE or like South Korea jump through. Kind of an extraordinarily generous deal. And what we were going to get out of this was that Saudi Arabia, this gross monarchy that's not going to be there in 5-10 years, was going to recognize Israel. And the extraordinary thing that happened next week was that the Biden administration was like, you know what? Screw it. You don't even have to do a deal with Israel anymore. And the Saudis were like, you know what? Screw it. Who cares about the Palestinians? Let's just do this security deal. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, this is insane. This is like the whole logic. And then it finally clicked with me. It's like, actually, the Saudi government and the U.S. government, for once, is more aware of the things that we talk about here than they are letting on. In fact, certainly the Saudi government, but also the U.S. government is very aware of just how tenuous these Saudi royal families' hold on power is in Saudi Arabia, and just how the writing, let's get biblical with it, the writing is on the wall. It is so clearly obvious if you just sort of open your eyes a little bit. In recent months, like thrillingly, when have I ever been thrilled by something that the Wall Street Journal is laying out? The Wall Street Journal, of all places, has started, just in the smallest way, to start looking at some of these Saudi projects with the same critical eye that we've been looking at these Saudi projects for the past 7 or 8 years, and it's quite illuminating. I mean, they have a very straightforward article this morning talking about NEOM, and just like, okay, let's talk about the line. Let's talk about what NEOM would require, and just talking about the cost here, the idea that this building would need to, the line, the famous line in the desert, this continuous 100-mile building, would need to be populated by more people than currently live in New York City. Like the costs of just that one building are likely to rise into the trillions of dollars. Like, none of this is ever going to happen. And we're beginning to see concessions of that by the Saudi government, which they've now backed off on. So initially, I think a couple weeks back, they said, by 2030, it's not going to be 100 miles long. It's going to be maybe a mile long, probably shorter. And of course, everybody noticed this and was like, what the hell? And they've since dialed back on that. But yeah, it's just, these are, as was obvious to anybody with any critical thinking skills, like these things are just not going to happen because of some simple math that we'll talk about a bit later. Well, why don't we just give a quick preview of that simple math? This is inflation-adjusted oil prices. This is a key thing that doesn't happen very often, which is people just looking back at the inflation-adjusted oil prices. If you say, oh, it's $90 a barrel of oil, this is great, supposedly. This is very good, supposedly. If you are going from the context of, I remember 10 years ago, $90 a barrel of oil was okay. That was pretty good for petrostates. Petrostates were pretty happy. If you look at inflation-adjusted prices over time, the story gets very different. What we have here is the prices from 2000 to 2020. Or more or less. So you can see here, this is the era of the China shock. This is WTI, I'm afraid. Brent is usually $4 or $5 more. But it was the WTI figures that I could find the historic stuff for. So if you look here, this is starting at the edge of the graph. You have this massive rise up through the China shock of the 2000s. And then you have this sort of expectation that grew up after the 2008 financial crisis. That's the big jag down in the middle there. This expectation that grew up not just among Gulf oil producers, but oil producers everywhere, that prices would just be at this sustained high level. So you've heard a lot about oil price spikes in the aftermath of Ukraine, oil becoming dramatically more expensive. The way that oil prices are reported are always like, oh man, they're so huge, this, that, and the other thing. But they're not paying. This is true when we look at like the price at the pump, like $3.50 a gallon of oil today, of gas today is, it would have been great to get the figures on the price at the pump, but I did not for today's presentation, unfortunately. What I do have is oil barrel prices. So people who've been in the oil barrel trading business have memories, and they're like, sure, 90, that's a good amount for us. But if you look at the actual numbers here, at only one point over the past decade have oil prices gotten to the point that they were at between, say, 2005 and 2014. And that was the extreme level of $120 a barrel that we reached when Russia invaded Ukraine. So you've got, and if you look at this graph here and compare that spike there towards the right end of the graph, and then you look at the entire decade from 2005 to 2014, you realize that that's Ukraine spike was lower than it was for most of this century. For the past decade, Saudi Arabia has been looking at a price of oil that is not capable of sustaining the Saudi royal family. Now, I think there's a misconception here that when we say that oil prices are lower than they've ever been, that, they're going to go down to zero. They're not. The territory of Saudi Arabia is going to be pumping oil for the next 100 years. The question is, what price can they get for it? And the kinds of activity that we see from the Saudi royal family, the Niams, the foreign policy belligerents, the this, that, and the other thing, are only capable if a certain price is maintained. That price has not been maintained. It is not at the level of self-sufficiency. The IMF estimates, this is from the Wall Street Journal article this morning, I believe, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, estimates that the price needs to be at that $100 a barrel level for Saudi Arabia to sustain itself. At almost no point over the past 10 years has that been at that level. And I believe that these prices are likely to go lower. If you look here at this 2015 to 2024 period, this is a period of extraordinary geopolitical what's the word I'm looking for here? Discombobulation. You've got Venezuela's oil industry, 3 million barrels a day, ripped off the market primarily by Trump sanctions in 2017. You've got massive secondary sanctions against Iran's oil market. They haven't been so effective recently, but I think it's likely that the Biden administration is going to start cracking down. Libya still managed to pump a little bit of oil, but they've got a ongoing civil war going. And since 2020, Russia has become a pariah state, subject to sanctions, subject to all kinds of crazy stuff. And the oil price is still lower than it has been for most of the century. And that, if anything, dials back just a little bit. If the instability in the Middle East stops, if some kind of ceasefire or at least slowdown is attained in Gaza, which the Biden administration might start working more seriously towards after Netanyahu's blown through their red lines, then we're actually going to get even lower prices. And it just makes the math harder and harder for Saudi Arabia to maintain. So far, so normal. Most of you have heard me talk about this sort of thing before. What I think I haven't emphasized enough, I've only emphasized in a few videos that are listed in the description, is how extraordinarily important Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are for maintaining a certain dark, grim stability in the Arab world. In the aftermath of the Arab Spring, the United States essentially outsourced its policy in a lot of North Africa, even in the Horn of Africa, and in the Middle East, to these really disgusting Gulf monarchies. That's appalling, but that is what we decided to do. There's a great myth, a number of great myths propagated about there are a number of great myths propagated about the Arab Spring. So specifically what happened, I mean, potentially you may not be familiar with this anymore. It's sort of a dominating factor of my worldview. I lived in Turkey, which can be described as part of the Middle East in 2011. Certainly a country that was very wrapped up in the events that fell from the Arab Spring, certainly in Syria. And it is a tremendously formative event for the region, and it's seen in U.S. foreign policy circles, Washington, D.C., as this sort of horrific failure, this horrific, abortive, terrible, nasty thing. It would have been better if Mubarak was still there, and it had never happened in the first place, and it's all about the nastiness of the Muslim Brotherhood and this, that, and the other thing. And this is not accurate. What it was is what it was initially sold as. Was kind of an extraordinary movement towards peace. I believe, was it in December 2010 or January 2011? We saw this start in Tunisia, which is a country that is very dear to me and a lot of other folks, but a fundamentally very small country that saw a sort of underprivileged guy set himself on fire to protest what had been happening in the just the corruption of his the government there, and that protest spread like wildfire. Within a couple months, the government of Egypt had fallen, and this is important. This is something I really want to emphasize today: is the incredible centrality of Egypt. And I think it's UAE actions around Egypt that I think give one of the clearest indications that we're kind of in the last gasp moments of the sort of Saudi and UAE resolution of the Arab Spring. Egypt, crucially, Hosni Mubarak, I think, resigned on February 11th, 2011. And this was an earthquake in the region. Egypt is a country of 100 million people. If you look at sort of a map of the region, which I intended to include in this presentation and did not, you can see, Tunisia. People talk about Tunisia or the Arab Spring in Bahrain, and these are comparatively quite small. I mean, Bahrain is a lot smaller than Tunisia. Small countries. Egypt, even in 2011, was a titan of 100 million people, and traditionally is actually the leader in the Arab world. This is traditionally this is something that has faded in recent years. I think probably Sadat's willingness to come to an agreement with the Israelis in the 70s really sort of cut out a lot of Egyptian influence throughout the Arab world, and then just the fact that it's been an economic basket case for decades since. And the Saudis and the UAE have had tons and tons of money to spread around. So the natural order of things, where Egypt, by far the most populous Arab country and traditionally a center of great power and legitimacy throughout the Arab world, it's sort of a 40-year aberration that Egypt isn't that important. In the Arab Spring, when Mubarak fell on February 11, 2011, that was massively, massively important. Huge deal. Egypt ended up having, I think, the first truly representative democratic elections in their history. Tunisia managed to put together a struggling democracy that lasted a full decade. These are real success stories that are now portrayed as just like horrific abortive failures, largely because Saudi Arabia and the UAE have put a lot of money into describing these as horrific abortive failures. What were horrific abortive failures were the US, Saudi, and UAE and Qatari efforts to overthrow the governments of Libya and Syria. In Syria, they failed. In Libya, they succeeded. Both countries have been plunged into a decade of civil war, and it's been quite horrific. The emphasis of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, with the exception of Libya and Syria, throughout this period was towards stability. And I think it's fair to characterize a bit of a dispute between the Obama administration and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, at least in the early years. So 2011, 2012 or so, the Obama administration really was like, oh, wait a second, look at this. This is a new dawn of freedom. This is amazing. And the Saudis and the UAE were like, what are you talking about? We need everybody to believe that Arabs have to have dictators. Are you kidding me? This is nightmarish. But the Saudis and the UAE are obviously nothing without the United States. So they had to kind of play along to an extent. And I think also the historic dislike of Syria's decades-long alliance with Iran also had them funding some rebels in Syria. But were they ever really serious about funding rebels in Syria? The way they went about it was possibly the worst way possible. It was funding a variety of jihadist militias that seemed to be as interested in fighting each other as they were. So it's clear that while the Gulf monarchies wanted Assad to have a hard time or to fall, they had zero interest in any kind of real democracy being established in Syria. Libya is another example of, well, Libya was kind of interesting. Nobody liked Muammar Gaddafi. Even after, in 2004, he had sort of come in from the cold. He had started paying a lot of money to a lot of French and U.S. politicians. He was roundly loathed, and I think Washington, D.C. was like, well, we lost Mubarak and we're losing Saleh. These are our guys. Let's go after Assad and Gaddafi, because, dictators are falling, and yet they did successfully knock over Gaddafi. And everybody, as I talk about a lot on this channel, everybody in Northern Africa has been suffering for that for a decade, a true lost economic decade we've given them, and a sort of metastasizing militia problem that had its... I was taken to task in comments earlier today. I mean, yes, there were absolutely jihadist militias and jihadist attacks before 2011, but the true Big Bang in the region was knocking over Libya. But anyway, so that with those caveats, with Syria and Libya, where Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been sort of more or less on board with U.S. projects of regime change, they have been firmly for the status quo, and if possible, rolling back what was done in the Arab Spring. That has been the goal, is to sort of like push things back, and that's what they successfully did, well, more or less successfully did in Egypt. I think probably the greatest example of how poorly served the United States has been by allowing Saudi Arabia and the UAE would be something that happened in Yemen in sort of, I think it was 2013, 2014 or something like that. You just describe it and it sounds absurd. The dictator, at that point he'd been in power since 1978. So like the 30-year dictator of 1979, the 30-year dictator of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, was finally forced out of power, I think in 2011, or was it early 2012? And the country was going to have a national dialogue conference, and they were going to bring in all the stakeholders, and it was seen by most as this incredible model, and they were going to try and figure out a government, they were going to try to figure out a constitution, and it was going to be great. But the people that we let run this process of building democracy, and to be clear, Yemen is one of the Arab states with the most, the longest history of serious elections. Saleh was definitely manipulating all of those elections, but there were legitimate votes with legitimate consequences during his time in power. And to bring the Yemeni democracy to fruition, the United States signed it over to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which is just think about that for a second. These absolute monarchies were going to shepherd Yemen into democracy. That is, of course, not what happened. The results of the National Dialogue Conference were perceived by, and probably I think fairly perceived by, elements in the north, the Houthis, and elements in the south that eventually became the Southern Transition Council. Basically the most powerful armed elements in Yemen thought that they were being sidelined by the Saudis, and Yemen has been at war for a decade since. So it is fascinating. Just that one Yemen anecdote just blew my mind. Thinking about that, having absolute monarchs try to set up a functioning democracy, it makes absolutely no sense, but that's what the United States did. That's who the United States signed the process over to. In Libya, we've seen multiple efforts by the United States and the United Nations to finally set up some kind of approved prime minister, or get to elections somehow. And again, we've seen it sabotaged by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Egypt would be the most egregious example. I went back and looked at this, and I was kind of blown away. So February 11, 2011, Hosni Mubarak resigns. July of 2013, now I'm not here to make a case for Morsi, other than the fact that he was democratically elected by the Egyptian people. That should be enough. Morsi was not a great president, did not do a great job, but he didn't deserve to die in prison. That's what happened to him. In July 2013, Sisi, the current dictator of Egypt, he's been there for 11 years now, as Egypt has fallen further and further into failure. This was kind of extraordinary to me. I didn't realize that Sisi's qualifications, or one of his main qualifications to be the next guy in charge, was he had actually spent a fair amount of time as the Egyptian military attaché in Riyadh, in the Saudi capital city. So Sisi is actually kind of groomed by Saudi Arabia to run Egypt. And then I didn't realize this, King Abdullah, this is the sensible guy before MBS. King Abdullah waited a full 2 hours to congratulate Sisi's coup government after it was announced. And I believe I'm not sure how well sourced this is, but I think, and subsequent history seems to bear this out, that any funding, there seemed to be some kind of promise by the Saudi royal family to replace any funding that Egypt lost from the United States for destroying Egypt's democracy. Tunisia, they could not be quite as open, but after 10 years of struggle, the Tunisian democracy collapsed, largely because the United States and Europe were much more interested in funding the military than we were in actually helping Tunisia rebuild any kind of economy. The problem with Tunisia's economy is that it's entirely dependent also on a high oil price in between two petrostates, and also on one of those two petrostates not being mired in a massive decade-long civil war, as the United States had plunged Libya into. So Tunisia, again, it was the Ennahda movement that won every election that Tunisia had and was massively and had to deal with elements throughout Tunisia government that were massively funded by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to discredit and disallow that democratic result. I think now, I could be wrong about this, but I think the head of Ennahda, like Mohammed Morsi, has now ended up in jail. It took a lot longer to get him there, but the Saudis are happy to have him there. The horrific example of Sudan, the truly tragic destruction there that is, I'd say, probably more of a UAE show. The currently being ripped apart by two warring military factions that were both supported by the UAE and Saudi Arabia against a democratic transition that attempted to start in 2019. Aforementioned that democratic transition was derailed by, among many, many, many other things, by being forced to sign a deal with Israel, which the Sudanese public was obviously appalled by. So it's been really grim, but that's what actually happened to the Arab Spring. That's what I want to emphasize here. It's not acknowledged enough that the Arab Spring didn't just sort of naturally fall apart because the Arabs just naturally can't handle democracy, or the Muslim Brotherhood is just here to do bad stuff. No, they fell apart because of a concerted strategy in country after country of Saudi Arabia and the UAE crushing democracy. That was their plan. They carried it out very successfully, and to the eternal shame of you can see why Gulf monarchies would want to do this. But to the eternal shame of the United States, we backed them almost everywhere. We continued to back their plays. And it was, and this was nightmarishly obvious. In March of 2011, Saudi Arabia and the UAE invaded Bahrain. This is what we got into the Middle East in a big way militarily to stop, right? Saddam Hussein, bigger neighbor, coming in for a smaller oil state. No, Saudi Arabia and the UAE sent 2,000 troops into Bahrain, which is a tiny, tiny country, to crush its Arab Spring in 2011. I mean, there was never a secret about what Saudi Arabia and the UAE were doing here. But what there was an absolute tidal wave, a tsunami of propaganda. When you hear the name Muslim Brotherhood, does that instantly just fill you, just like, oh gosh, the Muslim Brotherhood, that sounds terrible. And the Muslim Brotherhood, they must be terrible terrorists. They're not. The Muslim Brotherhood has links to almost no serious acts of terrorism, or at least not after, it's a little wishy-washy. But then, of course, the United States has a lot of links to serious kinds of terrorism. The main exception with the Muslim Brotherhood is Hamas, which is a organization that has become quite famous recently. The thing is that unlike Al-Qaeda, unlike the Saudi government with its Wahhabi funding, the Muslim Brotherhood is not this unified thing. What it is a movement across the Arab world that has branches in country after country, and they do have affinities. I mean, obviously, no Muslim Brotherhood government or party is ever going to say anything against Hamas, nor would any democratic representative of an Arab population. That's just the world that we live in. Arabs are more bothered by the 50-year occupation than they are by the October 7th massacre. And maybe there would have been a recalculation there had Israel not leapt at the opportunity to kill 50 times more people. Is that where Jesus Christ, we're really at? Israel has killed 50 times more people than were killed 50 times more Palestinians than were killed on October 7th. Talk about a way to utterly besmirch and dishonor a sacrifice. Hamas is Muslim Brotherhood affiliated vaguely. That's really the only terror organization. The Muslim Brotherhood in fact, I believe, wasn't this the case that there was Muslim Brotherhood representative in the Israeli government at one point? I could be wrong about that, but I do think There's some, are there, because there was for the first time to try and get rid of Netanyahu. God, it would have been such a better world if that had been done. Over the past couple of years, there was finally an Israeli Arab party was allowed into Israeli government, and I feel like there might have been some Muslim Brotherhood affiliation. Don't quote me on that, but regardless, the Muslim Brotherhood has been a part of parliamentary democracy in Morocco. It was a part of the democratic experiment in Tunisia, and the reason that the UAE and Saudi Arabia flagrantly hate this movement is not because of Hamas. It is because in country after country, the Muslim Brotherhood attempted to implement real Arab democracy. And real Arab democracy is a nuclear threat to the legitimacy of the Gulf monarchies. So that is what. Okay, somebody says that the Islamist party in Israel is not Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, well, thank you. Sorry about that. But so anyway, it was basically the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood was so demonized everywhere that you can still have like congressmen in the United States who believe that Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and the Muslim Brotherhood are like interchangeable things. They are not. The Muslim Brotherhood in almost all countries is committed to democracy. And that is what we want for the Arab world. That is not what Saudi Arabia and the Gulf wanted. A really great example of this, I'm doing a lot of Yemen research recently. It's an extraordinary BBC documentary on the fact that the UAE was paying a bunch of US mercenaries to assassinate people in Yemen. And these were sort of special forces guys. I'm not saying they're idiots. They have incredible ranges of talents that I could never understand. But they don't understand politics very good. And what was so extraordinary here is that they were largely assassinating Saudi allies that the UAE didn't like. Because the Muslim Brotherhood is present in every single country and tends to be the most successful democratic element, the Yemeni elements that are against the Houthis had tremendous Islam representation. And if the UAE actually wanted to defeat the Houthis more than they wanted to kill Arab Democrats, then this never would have happened. But they really wanted to kill Muslim Democrats, so they just told these ex-special forces, U.S. mercenaries, they're the Muslim Brotherhood. And they're like, oh, and they're just being interviewed by this BBC woman who's like, well, they're terrorists. They're the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's actually, if you want to defeat the Houthis, the Islah Party was kind of an important element in being able to do that. They had some elements of real democratic legitimacy, and the UAE killed them. So not only is the Gulf Monarch agenda against democracy in the region, it's against foreign policy goals that are supposedly very important to the United States and Israel, like defeating the Houthis. The UAE was more interested in assassinating Muslim Brotherhood people who were fighting against the Houthis than they were in actual victory against the Houthis. So I think I've belabored this a lot, but I think that's the key thing to realize here, that across the region, the context within which all these folks are operating is a status quo that has been put together by Saudi and UAE money and by Saudi and UAE firepower in very real ways, or funding that becomes firepower. In Sudan, the horrific civil war between two terrible actors, but there is one worse actor. There's the Sudanese armed forces, bad dudes, and then there is the RSF that came into being largely to carry out the Darfur genocide in the first decade of this century. The UAE is, of course, backing the genocidaires with a lot of money that has led them to being much more successful against the Sudanese armed forces than anybody expected them to be. So it's all quite sad. What were we talking about? Yes, so we've got this status quo that is Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And what I want to emphasize today is that this status quo is incredibly fragile. I'll take you back to those oil prices. For a decade now, Saudi Arabia has not been making enough money to do all the things that it wants to do. There's still a lot of money flowing through. Don't get me wrong, but these things, the scope of Saudi activity has been shrinking. I think that's something that I've really only been realizing over the past month or so as I've zeroed back in. It's just this crazy thing where it's just like, wait a second. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, during the Trump administration was fucking crazy. Like the stuff that he did in like a 3-year period, like launched a massive war in Yemen, decided to, tried to attack Qatar, was only held back by Jim Mattis and Rex Tillerson, the Trump's Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, fired, I think kidnapped a Lebanese president or prime minister and got him to resign. Of course, killed Jamal Khashoggi. Just like absolute like balls out crazy stuff. That's, oh, and also giving interviews talking about how Iran was Hitler. Just like you have to understand that Saudi Arabia in 2024 is a very different animal from Saudi Arabia in, say, 2017 through 2020. And that is something that I think indicates that even the Saudi government knows that this sort of this era of endless expenditure on everything is coming to an end. For 5 years now, Saudi Arabia has been trying desperately to get out of Yemen, to the point where when the Houthis started bombing the Red Sea, what should have been now we get to really go and invade Yemen. They would have loved that in 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. They've been like, hey, let's all just like ease off here. We've got a peace deal we want to put together. Let's all try and simmer down, folks. They don't do that sort of thing anymore. The UAE is kind of doing the same thing. For years, the United Arab Emirates made it impossible for any kind of serious attempt at resolution in Libya. They're now sort of backing down and backing off. And obviously, there's still a spoiler. There's still a problem. But I think that especially after the Houthi bombings of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in 2019, these countries realized like, oh, hey, wait a second. Like, actually, maybe we don't have the scope to do all these things that we want to do. Maybe we should try to actually be friendly with some of these countries. Turkey had a huge rivalry with Saudi Arabia. It was the reason that we even heard the name Jamal Khashoggi, because the Turks kept leaking all of that information, quite masterfully, actually. Leaking information, drip-drabbing into the news cycle, the information of Khashoggi's assassination. That's all sort of over. Like, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are like, okay, like they are backing off. They are trying desperately to find ways to spend less money on foreign policy. And I think that's a real shift in both Saudi and UAE policy that I think is kind of unacknowledged. Yes, it's because they realized Trump wasn't going to be for them be there for them when Iran got frisky. But also, it's just that they didn't have the money anymore. Already, over the course of MBS's time in power, he personally is doing insane stuff, like paying like $500 million for a fake Leonardo da Vinci and buying the big boats, this, that, and the other thing. But very quickly, when he got into power, he cut off most of the Saudi royal family and most of the traditional elites of Saudi Arabia and absorbed all their money. Since 2019, the hyper-aggressive, insane Saudi foreign policy is largely over because they can't afford it anymore. And I think we're going to see a lot of other stuff start to sort of shake and fall apart. Quick counterexample. So there's here. This is the longer view. This is an inflation-adjusted oil prices going back to like 1950. So you see the oil crisis here in 1970, huge deal. Things got very expensive. But if you look between 1980 and really almost all the way to 2000. a 20-year period there with some spikes. Oil prices were actually pretty low, not as low as they were before 1970. And the Saudis were able to deal with that. Why is this as a counter argument? Like, why wouldn't they be able to deal with it this time around? Like, why wouldn't they be able to deal with sustained lower prices, even if they do get down to $40 a barrel? Why wouldn't they be able to deal with that again? Well, a lot of things have changed. Saudi Arabia in population in 1980 was 10 million. Saudi population today is most of 40 million. That's a lot more dependents that have to be kept happy. And a key aspect of the Arab Spring story was the fact that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and the rest of the Gulf monarchies had to just sort of give all these goodies to their population to get them to shut up and not take to the streets. Yes, there was horrific coercion of people who sort of stood out, but there was also just a very real acknowledgement that in order to keep people from getting to the streets, they needed handouts, more handouts. And they had already been giving handouts. So there's just sort of like a level of Saudi handouts to maintain the Saudi royal family that is much higher than it was in the 1980s. And part of this is like a very happy story. Like, the population of Saudi Arabia is vastly more educated than it was in the 1980s. There's vastly more of them. But that level of education means that they're not going to be as easily placated anymore. And I do have to say, I've been talking about Saudi Arabia since 2017. I have been surprised and impressed by the number of activities that have been able to be carried out by MBS in terms of not any of this NEOM garbage. I have been surprised actually by the success of a lot of their tech investments. They've been investing in crap. Like, we are definitely in the era of diminishing returns when it comes to Silicon Valley. Like, a lot of crypto garbage. Now they're big into a lot of AI garbage. But they've been playing the Wall Street game reasonably successfully. There have been some tremendous losers, like WeWork, of course. They dumped $20 billion into a company that's now essentially meaningless, worthless. But there have been successes. SoftBank is not the Saudi Arabia's partner in a lot of this, has not gone out of business yet. So that's been more successful than I expected. But also, Saudi Arabia has introduced a value-added tax. I did not expect them to be able to do that. Also, a lot of the Saudi Arabian localization efforts have been successful. Not completely successful, but they have cut out a lot of sort of expat or slave labor aspects of their economy. I've been impressed with how much of that has been capable of being done, but it just doesn't deal with this fundamental difficulty. The prices needed to have been at $100 a barrel for the past decade. Prices are maintained at this high level here because of an incredible level of geopolitical instability that I do not believe can be maintained. The only thing that could maintain this price level would be a larger scale U.S. war with Iran, which would wipe out pretty much all Gulf oil production. You'd wipe out Iranian production, and then the Iranians would wipe out the rest. We're not talking about, blocking the Strait of Hormuz. No, we're talking about just bombing it into nothing. We've known since 2019 that Iran has that capability. That's something that should be focused on a little more seriously. And I think something that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have come to a realization with is that actually there's more and more elements in the United States that wouldn't really be that heartbroken if all of Gulf oil production was taken offline. And I think that the Saudis and the UAE are beginning to realize that actually U.S. interests are not their interests here. So there is that caveat. We could get a massive war between the U.S. and Iran, which would also wipe out the Gulf monarchies entirely and would lead to a region-wide Arab Spring redux or what have you. I think probably to close, we should go back to, I'm still looking at that, there we go. To close, we should go back to the centrality of Egypt. And I think this is a place where we're getting a real indication of growing desperation. They had a currency crisis. The Houthis shutting down the Red Sea, shut down the Suez Canal. And this was, we did not end up falling into worldwide supply chain crisis, the way that the Peter Zehans of the world might want to emphasize. But the Egyptians basically lost one of their biggest sources of hard currency. The story for the past 12 years has been, for the past 11 years, since 2013, has been Sisi being really bad at running Egypt and just going to the Gulf Monarchs for handout after handout. And the Gulf Monarchs are often, this is the last time, and now we're getting serious about demanding something in return, and but they end up just going back over and over again. And now they are getting things in return, theoretically. But the, how valuable are those titles to land going to be if the Egyptian state collapses? Which I think is a very real. We basically almost saw it a couple of weeks back. And the United Arab Emirates jumped in with $35 billion. The United Arab Emirates is a very rich country. We talk about sums of billions of dollars on this channel a lot. So it can be like, $35 billion. $35 billion is like 7% of the UAE's annual GDP. Like, that's a lot of money to be shunted away, like a significant percentage of a country's GDP being put into cash and shunted away to another country is an extraordinarily heavy lift. And this is after the UAE and Saudi Arabia are like, oh, no more free handouts for Egypt. That is an extraordinary sign of desperation. And there were follow-up articles talking about it's not just this one $35 billion project. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are buying stuff up across the Egyptian economy, because the Egyptian economy has to sell off all these state-owned enterprises because it is in desperate, desperate straits. And if Saudi Arabia collapses, again, 110 million people, center of the Arab world, it's over. Like, everything in the region falls apart. And frankly, Israel going into Rafah, as they are right now, is a pretty key part of that. Not a key part. It is a striking blow at the Egyptian government's legitimacy. So I'm not saying that all of this is going to happen tomorrow, but it could. And I very much expect it by 2030. And I think I'll be talking about that a little more coming up in some more produced videos. Just to close, the model that I've done Arab Spring videos where I talk about the French Revolution just because people know more about it, but the model that I really think about and have been thinking about, at least for a decade now, is the 1848 revolutions in Europe. This is 1848, the springtime of peoples. The whole continent, because of communications technologies, really advanced stuff like the telegraph and mass literacy in the newspapers. Multiple European countries, from Hungary to Italy to France, all rose as one, and they were all crushed. They were all absolutely steamrolled by a monarchical reaction. And I think that's exactly what we've seen in the Arab world over the past decade. What eventually happened was the causes of 1848 were victorious in country after country. First in Hungary, that got its sort of quasi-independence in the 1860s. The German unification, that was a rallying cry during 1848, happened in 1870. So while 1848 and the Arab Spring of 2011 were immense failures initially, I think that the progress of the Arab Spring as a concept and the sort of path of history in the region is going to trend towards actual true Arab democracy again, as we had in Tunisia for a decade and was sorely neglected. So I guess that's the presentation. Just about an hour, it seems like, 55 minutes. Oh, I guess I was a little late, so perhaps less. Do we have questions? Are there things that folks would like to hear me talk about? I will start engaging with chats as they come along. Yes, this is a business nominally. I'm quite craven. If you participate with a super chat and decide to give me money, I will definitely answer your question. But I will deal with other questions as well if there are no super chats, as I've seen. I saw somebody was challenging me to come on a podcast to talk about my ideas. I'm always interested in that. Please contact me if you want me to come on your podcast. It needs to be a podcast that exists. I need to be able to view, what happens on that podcast. And sort of general level of civility or whatnot. But if it's a podcast where I'm going to come on and not just have a shouting match, I'm almost certainly going to do it. So yeah, please feel free to contact me and talk to me about that. What would happen to Palestine after Hamas is tubled? I don't know what tubled is. Tunisian industry is quite limited. No, that's true. From your point of view, will Algeria be affected? Of course. I think that Algeria has already had the sort of Hirak movement or what have you. I guess that was 2019. In 2019, they sort of talked about a kind of abortive second Arab Spring. And unfortunately, the two countries they were thinking about were Algeria and Sudan. President Bouteflika was, this guy who was basically a vegetable in a chair, announced that he was going to be running for president again. Rather, his handlers announced it, and then it's kind of parallels to the United States right now. But the Algerian people decided that was not possible, and actually kept a pretty strong protest movement going through the length of 2019 that a lot of people were quite hopeful about. And then sort of COVID kind of quashed that. And Sudan had a incredibly inspiring democracy movement that got taken out by essentially Gulf funding for these two military factions that have now fallen out with each other and are fighting an absolutely horrific civil war. And I think that this is kind of a key thing here. The Algerians have been making the argument for decades at this point. See, this is what happens if you try to do democracy. This is what happens. Syria happens. Sudan happens. You're safer with us. You're safer with us. And to be fair, Algeria experienced a horrific civil war in the 1990s. Of course, they experienced this horrific civil war because the junta wouldn't allow so the military dictatorship would not allow a Islamist party to take power, even though they had won an election. And maybe there's some truth to that, but also there's Tunisia, and Algeria and Tunisia are right next to each other. They, I think, have a lot in common just in terms of levels of wealth and development, historic approaches towards modernization or what have you. So I actually think that Algeria is, what I wanted for frickin' years and talked about was if Tunisia could just be funded by the EU or the United States, in a tiny way, just $1 billion a year. That's all it would have taken. $1 billion a year would have allowed Tunisia to have a healthier, more sustainable economy, like a Marshall Plan for Tunisia, except at a fraction of the price of the Marshall Plan. And that democracy could have quite easily spread to Algeria, spread to Morocco. These are both, Algeria and Morocco are both countries that have a lot of the rudiments of functioning parliamentary systems. And to have a robust, successful Tunisian democracy would have inspired, we already saw the street movement in Algeria, would have inspired a more real effort towards democracy in Algeria and Morocco. These democracies could have provided inspiration to Libya, the end of that war, and you really could have had this just sort of true wave of democracy. And I think that's actually still very possible. It'll be very interesting to see, how well Kais Saied can hold on to his dictatorship of Tunisia without Gulf funding. I'm not sure what the direct relationships are with the Gulf funding. No, he gets a lot of U.S. funding. Europe decided to finally give him $1 billion. They gave the dictator $1 billion instead of the democracy that struggled for a decade and died because of economic deprivation. Anyway, talk about Turkey's influence in the Middle East. Turkey's influence in the Middle East is strong. It is interesting the extent to which I think the serious level of exhaustion. This was something I wanted to talk about. I was talking before October 7th about, you know what, like, I think Saudi Arabia and the UAE are guaranteed to fall. Like, that's happening before the end of the decade. Why doesn't everybody just sort of relax? Like, wouldn't it be nice to just give the region a break? And like, you know, just everyone should just kick back and like, sure, it's a dictator's peace, but let it be a dictator's peace. The region needs a break. Obviously, October 7th has kind of thrown that over. And now we're in this position where, you know, the dictator's peace is looking incredibly fragile, and I don't think it will be maintained. But how this relates to Turkey's influence in the Middle East is the fatigue. I think that the Arab Spring, one of the dynamics of the Arab Spring was that as the UAE and Saudi Arabia were super opposed to any indication of Arab democracy, Erdogan was all for it. Erdogan is the result of Islamic democracy. Turkey has proved, as recently as this last local election, that it still has robust democracy. Turkey. I know everybody loves to hate on Erdogan. I love to hate on Erdogan. Not hate, but I just would like him to no longer be in power. But Erdogan in 2011 and for years thereafter was going to battle against the Gulf monarchies in the name of democracy. That was something that was actually happening that we weren't allowed to talk about or think about in those terms because of who was doing the most lobbying in Washington, D.C. and, you know, what our journalists were sympathetic with. I think that with Turkey's ongoing economic crises, finally by 2019, 2020, Turkey was like, whatever, to the point where he actually, Erdogan was outraged by what happened to the Egyptian democracy in 2013, spoke very strongly about that for years. I think just a couple of years back, he actually was together with Sisi in a meeting, the dictator who put Morsi in jail and eventually killed him. So I think Turkey has kind of backed off on the really strong nastiness against UAE and Saudi Arabia, which I think is a shame, but is also kind of because the Turkish economy just needs a lot more money, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia were willing to provide it. And also Turkey has other priorities. The ongoing occupation of Syria is expensive and a pain in the ass, and they don't seem to want to give it up. So they're probably going to continue to focus more on that than this broad-based battle. And perhaps in Turkey, they've come to similar realizations to the ones they've come to in the Gulf governments and the United States and here, which is that none of this is sustainable. It's all going to fall apart. So why not just take as much money from the Gulfies as they can? So I think that, however, Erdogan's not as inspiring as he once was. Certainly, the making the big push against Israel for the first time, cutting off economic ties with Israel, is a huge deal and may provide another big push for Turkish legitimacy. As we've learned from Yemen and the Houthis, there is no better way to build legitimacy and popularity in the Arab world than attacking Israel. And Turkey, Erdogan seems to be trying that old magic again. But I think Turkey has had a very powerful, very unified idea of Middle Eastern influence for about 2 decades now. That would be Erdogan, and I think Erdogan is a largely expended force. Even he, I don't believe it, but even he talks about how the last election was his last election. So, yeah, that's what I have to say about Turkey's influence in the Middle East. Skipto says, I can't read. Well, that's sad. Skipto, you've given me a super chat, so I feel obligated to engage with your content a little bit more. Skipto, do you have a question for me? Is there something you want to say, Skipto? For your $2, you deserve more. Peter Zihan is vastly superior. Well, that's sad. But hey, you're generous, so I'll say what you want to say. I can't read, says Skipto. Love your work. Any thoughts on Mexico, says Fisca con Daniel. Thank you, Fisca con Daniel. Any thoughts on Mexico? I have a wide range of thoughts on Mexico. I'm very excited about the upcoming election. I think the consensus is Claudia Sheinbaum is going to win, I think is the consensus, the successor to AMLO. I've seen a lot of talk about, is AMLO really going to let her run the country? And, AMLO is this coded in the United States as this sinister force. There are definitely reasons to dislike AMLO and what he's been doing in Mexico, but dislike it more than Peña Nieto or Calderón, it's kind of hard for me to say. There's certainly been a lot of talk about the militarization of Mexico under AMLO. That's not a good thing. I think there's a lot of back and forth. Like, has he made things better with the narcos? Has he not made things better with the narcos? His narco record, no matter what interpretation of the numbers you look at, stands head and shoulders above the last two guys. I think some say that it's been going down a little bit, the number of murder and destruction. Some say that, that's just manipulating the numbers. But nobody said they've gone up. And under Peña Nieto and Calderón, the number of narco deaths went up, escalated dramatically. I do think that AMLO has a lot of Trumpy, irritating elements as a leader, and I think Claudia Sheinbaum seems to be less Trumpy, frankly. I think that the assumption for a lot of people in U.S. business circles, in U.S. media, is that, AMLO is going to be the real president, as if, Mexico is Russia or something. Mexico is a country that has, for 24 years now, has had real alternation between political parties. And before, for the 80 years before, yes, it was a one-party state, but it was a one-party state with some I think real changes in power and a commitment to not having the same president. I do think that I'm AMLO followers would get a little bothered if Sheinbaum was the president and AMLO was really the power. So I think that I'm kind of optimistic, cautiously optimistic. I want to see what Sheinbaum can do. The fundamentals, and this is a little Zion-like, I guess. The fundamentals are so good for Mexico over the next decade. Just the nearshoring that we're going to do, the rise in industrial capacity and production in North America generally. It's just going to be awesome for Mexico. And I do think that whether you love AMLO or hate him domestically, it's hard to disagree that AMLO's sort of rhetorical approaches and general personality probably made it a little bit harder for Mexico to pick up business. So structurally, for the past 5 years, it's just been fire hose of business to Mexico that AMLO has kind of stood in the way of a little bit. So of course, Mexican industrialization and business has gone through the roof, but I think it could have gone higher with somebody other than AMLO being there, and somebody other than AMLO is about to be there. So I'm pretty optimistic about Mexico, but I could be wrong. Most of my Mexican friends, who yes do tend to be a little on the wealthier and more elite side, hate AMLO, and I think they've got some reasons for that seem rational, and some that seem less so. So it'll be interesting to see what AMLO's party does under new leadership. And I think it's just kind of cool that Mexico, I think for the first time, right, is likely to have a female president. That's pretty cool. Again, beating the United States. So yeah. Oh dear, I am behind on these super chats. I will catch up. Oh, yes, well, that's okay. Abdul Aziz, why are you barking about the... Abdul Aziz Al-Zabi says, why are you barking about the UAE and cuck for the Muslim Brotherhood? I think I described at length that the Muslim Brotherhood, is actually a movement that's for Arab democracy and has proved itself to be so, has been martyred, frankly, for Arab democracy over and over and over again over the past decade. So yeah, I wouldn't go as far as to call myself a cuck for the UAE, but I think that the UAE, a cuck for the Muslim Brotherhood, but I think that the Muslim Brotherhood is an interesting movement. Obviously, there are deplorable elements of the Muslim Brotherhood, like Hamas. But it is an interesting aspect of. That's an interesting thing. So, a Muslim Brotherhood, it's a movement and it's an ideology that is part of the intellectual furniture and now history of the Arab world in a very serious way, in a way that the United Arab Emirates simply is not. The United Arab Emirates is like a gas station that has figured out how to bribe people. The Muslim Brotherhood is just objectively more impressive than the UAE, if that is a more serious answer than perhaps you were looking for why I am barking about the UAE and a cuck for the Muslim Brotherhood. You've been generous. Well, actually, I don't really know how much the AED is, so I feel like I should engage more. But I'm sure you'll have more comments, Terry, and I'll try to hit that. Peter Zihan is vastly superior, says Skipto. Well, thank you. I don't agree, but hey. Aspirin says Ankara and Istanbul mayors are looking to run for the next presidential election. Yes, that's very true, Aspirin, and I'm very pleased by that. But it is kind of, unfortunately, that weren't we excited about that for the last election? Ekrem İmamoğlu is not a new dynamic in Turkish politics at this point. He won those local elections 5 or 6 years ago, right? And then we had the 2023 national. So for those who aren't familiar, Turkey has 2 sets of elections. It has the national for everything, and then it has all of the local elections. It's like as if every governor and really mayor in the country got elected at the same time. And those are the elections that Erdogan's party, the AK party, lost a month or so back. But the national elections, in 2023, he won by the skin of his teeth against a opponent that everybody was mystified by. Why the joint opposition had chosen to run this sort of old professor who, and this is terrible to bring up, but was unfortunately, from a minority that a lot of people don't trust in Turkey. It was just all very a very high stakes election, and it seems like, honestly, it kind of seems like people were more interested in preserving Turkish democracy than they were in getting rid of Erdogan. I think there's probably a very real calculation by İmamoğlu, and I can't remember the Ankara guy's name, that if they had actually run, these much more attractive figures had run for the office of the president, perhaps Erdogan would have done more to actually crush democracy. Or in the event of running against Kılıçdaroğlu, there was certainly vast irregularities. That his people own all the media, this, that, and the other thing, but it didn't seem like democracy was crushed as much as it would have had to have been if İmamoğlu had run. So I don't know, but yeah, I share your hope about İmamoğlu in Istanbul and the Ankara guy whose name escapes me. But I'm just sort of but we had that hope for the last election cycle, 5 fucking years ago. But yeah, no, Aspirin, that is a valid point worth pointing to. Grizzly Akan 94 has given me $1 for nothing. Oh, okay, there's your question. I sent a super chat. I listened to your podcast this morning. Why did you ignore the Tuareg oppression in Niger and Mali? I know some Tuareg Berbers, and they see themselves as oppressed by their government. I think this is a very good point, and I think I've been taken to task by Fadal in the Discord. If you haven't joined our patrons-only Discord, you should certainly do so. But Fadal and others have rightly been taking me to task in the Discord for glossing over the details of the jihadi insurgency in that podcast. And I think that's entirely right. I think the only answer is, frankly, I got lazy. And it's a valid point that I think I've done a better job in bringing up and produce videos on the topic. I'm not going to get into the minutia of Tuareg movements from Morocco to Niger and Mali. But a point that I should have made, and thank you for bringing this up, Grizzly, is that I think I was too glib in using the jihadi militant framing that the central governments of Mali, Niger, and other countries and the U.S. government like to use here. It's just too attractive to me to say, like, oh my God, the violence has gone up 50,000% since the United States got there. The truth about this is that they are not. Some of them are jihadi militants, like ISWAP exists. All these movements that are connected for branding reasons or more serious reasons to the Islamic State do exist. But broadly, the issue in this region is that these governments are unrepresentative, and there are ethnicities that prior to this incredible mess that the war on terror and the Libya destruction brought to the region, prior to that were I don't know if they're being managed better in a repressive sense, or were slightly more allowed into the systems as they existed, probably a combination of both of those. But there are legitimate, very legitimate national aspirations. I am not someone for divvying up countries in any way. I am someone who's interested in autonomy, but national aspirations, and also just like, can we teach our kids in our own language? Can we have a basic slice of economic existence? These questions, the flood of U.S. counterterror money allowed Niger, Mali, and a variety of other countries to get more authoritarian and stop negotiating and stop trying to resolve these national questions in ways that were helpful to these varieties of movements. So I guess I should probably apologize. I think that today's podcast was worthwhile in a number of ways, but that is a glaring oversight. Not pointing out that the jihadist, the murders committed by jihadists is a very dumb and incomplete way to describe a vast variety of resistance movements in Mali, Niger, the Sahel more broadly, that are, some of them are exactly well, actually they're not, because even the ISWAP and the other Islamic State vaguely affiliated things are not organizations that are going to be able to come out and bomb Paris. They're just not. But beyond the jihadi terror organizations, there are a lot of legitimate. There are a lot of groups with more legitimate national aspirations and grievances. They're being crushed quite mercilessly right now. So yeah, thank you, Grizzly Akan, for pointing that out. Mustafa Soylemez, I assume. Why don't you shill for some power and get their financing? I like Duran. Yeah, the best pro-Russian content. How can I become a shill for a power? I just don't. I'm a shill for U.S. power, actually. I don't think I I don't think I really dissemble the fact that I'm quite pro-U.S. hegemony. I think that there are actually a lot of really good things about the United States being in power, being on top, which is why I find our screw-ups so incredibly frustrating. I don't really see the point in shilling. I would have a lot of difficulty in sort of shilling for Russia the way that Duran does. It's just kind of pointless. It's just why do you want to? I mean, also taking money from the UAE and the Saudi. I mean, if I like taking money from UAE and the Saudis, I guess my principles are just worth a little bit more than that. They are. I would have to lie to you to tell you that we're living in a multipolar world. I would have to lie to you to tell you that there's any threat to U.S. hegemony that I see anywhere in the world. And I'm not really interested in lying to you. I guess I'm just very lucky in that I've attained a level of success here, and also some success on the stock market. So I don't have to really. Yeah, I guess I think that's a cute super chat and a cute question. Yeah, people love Duran, and I tried to because people love Duran enough that there'd be a good group of folks to to do a critique of, but it's just like two middle-aged dudes just sort of shooting the shit with each other, talking about how awesome Russia is, and it's boring content. It's hard. I can't bring myself to watch enough of it to develop any kind of critique. Like it's interesting. There's a lot of there. How can I become a shill for a power? That's an amusing approach. Skipto, Grizzly, I bet Peter Zihan could answer your question. Skipto, well, hey man, Skipto, if you want to be generous and talk about how awesome Peter Zihan is, Skipto, I am here for it all day. Loga, be merciful. Imagine if the U.S. had to run in and defend Saudi Arabia. Peter DeLace, yeah, that's a really key point, actually, and that's what. Sorry, I don't know that I completed that in the presentation. That's why the United States just wants this deal. They want a legal obligation to go in and defend Saudi Arabia, and that is, of course, exactly what we should not do. The people have asked me for years, and I may finally do it. Like, what is the scenario, Rob? Okay, Saudi Arabia is falling. What happens? What happens is there's a wide range of possibilities that could be dark or more positive or whatnot if the United States stays out. If the United States signs this deal, not with Saudi Arabia, let's be honest here, we're not talking about a deal with Saudi Arabia, we're talking about a deal with the Saudi royal family. If the United States signs this deal with Saudi Arabia, then it's like a guaranteed Vietnam. Like it's a guaranteed, like here's this incredibly illegitimate, nasty royal family that we're going to go in and defend for a decade. If that's the situation that they're trying to create with this Abraham Accords. And if we do that, then yeah, guaranteed it's going to be awful. So the first most important question is the United States going to be smart enough to just let the Saudis fall? Hey, welcome them to the French Riviera and the suburban Washington, D.C., the royal family. Probably with a lot more of the Saudi money than they should have. Of course, we did that with the Shah. It didn't work out so well. But, I support that degree of loyalty to our clients. We should absolutely, when the Saudis begin to fall, welcome them into cushy exile. We should absolutely not put in a single U.S. soldier or a single $1 million to try to keep them in power. Because, not just 9/11, but also just, it's an absolute monarchy. Like, if the principles of the founding fathers of the United States mean frickin' anything, what the hell are we doing here? Anyway. Abdulaziz Al-Zabi says, 1, I want to apologize for my outburst. Well, thank you. You need to talk to Emiratis because you clearly lack understanding of our history and geopolitics. Thank you. Well, that's a very kind. I was kind of hoping, Abdulaziz, you'd be like, number 1, I want to apologize for my outburst. Number 2, you're a fucking Muslim Brotherhood cook. I think that would have been funny. But thank you for your civil. I should read another book on the United Arab Emirates. You're right, actually. I should get up. It is, it's such a tiny place with such convoluted politics. I was reading something recently that I found kind of fascinating, just sort of talking about how the 2008 really changed the dynamics in UAE politics. Apparently there's 7 emirates. You can correct me here, Abdulaziz. Apparently there's like 7 emirates, and it used to be more of an equal relationship between Abu Dhabi and the UAE. Sorry, Abu Dhabi and Dubai. But then Dubai had what's the word? Dubai had a financial crisis in 2008. Like, they almost collapsed was 2008, 2009, something like that. And Abu Dhabi had to bail them out. And since 2008, it's really just MBZ, is who we talk about. So, yeah. Are you guys having any difficulty streaming? There seems to be, I'm getting an error message. Let me know. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Abdulaziz Al-Zabi. I'm not going to stop giving UAE a hard time and being a cuck for the Muslim Brotherhood, as you've also pointed out. But I should actually dive in on the UAE a little bit, if only because of the amount of money that they spin into U.S. politics. And as I've described in this presentation, they have immense influence across the region. So, Yes. Loga is pointing out that you should all join our patrons only Discord, which there is a price for. But yes, you should join the Discord. You should sign up as a patron. It's the patrons that keep this project going. I've actually been quite pleased. More and more people have been signing up for the Patreon recently, and the conversations on the Discord channel get more and more interesting. If you do sign up, you get one of these every month, guaranteed. It's a patrons only news chat where I basically interact with every single comment that everybody puts in. I put together like 12 news items that I think have been useful, interesting from the month before, with suggestions from patrons, and we just discuss them for 2 hours. That's for patrons only, and then we also have the Discord chat, which is like kind of like a Zoom talk. And that is also available for patrons only. So yeah, sign up on Patreon. Yay. Logo has put links in the chat. Okay, super chat. Aboobs. Well, okay, question. What do you think about the situation in the West Bank right now? Do you think there will be any Arab-style protest against the government? Will that affect pressure Jordan in any way? I think there have been really serious protests in Jordan specifically. I mean, I think what we're at is like just a position of extreme fatigue. I think one of the great this grim myth of the Arab Spring and how, oh gosh, Arabs can't really handle democracy, and if they try, you're just going to end up with a Syria or a Sudan. I think that myth has a lot of sway over Arab populations at this point. And I think that as we're seeing in Jordan with massive street protests, I think that it would take something. Maybe it's Israel's, it is too, I think I've jumped the gun on Rafah a couple times. During the Super Bowl, Israel bombed Rafah, and I was like, oh my God, Israel's going into Rafah. And in fact, they were just doing a bombing in Rafah. What has happened over the past 24 hours, they took I think the last checkpoint between Egypt and Gaza that Israel did not control. And this could be preliminary to a full-on horrific, essentially genocide of the people in Rafah. Or it could be like, we're doing this and we're going to step back. I mean, who knows? It's possible that in the coming weeks, that could get even worse than we'd expected. We could see hundreds of thousands of people walking out of Rafah into Egypt. That could take Sisi out. Or Israel back off Rafah. Somehow things will keep limping on for another 2 years. It would be too perfect, but I think it's actually quite plausible. Of range of possibilities would be that finally, be it the Biden or the Trump administration a couple of years from now, finally gets a big deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the United States, and they sign this deal, and then that is actually what causes the Saudi royal family to fall and the rest of the region to fall like dominoes. That's a possibility, but I can't tell you exactly what's going to happen. I can't tell you. It's already absurd that I'm some dude in New York talking about what the Arab world is or isn't going to do. But I do think some kind of large-scale rising, some kind of serious change to the status quo across the region is more or less inevitable in the next 5 or 6 years. When? Don't know. Tomorrow? Maybe. Probably not. But yeah. Okay. Martin Stone. Zion is the type of guy who shoots the arrow first and then paints the bullseye. That's funny. What, Skipto's not there to stand up for his guy? All right. I guess those are all the super chats. Nobody else has anything? I'm a whore for super chats. All right, let's see. Indian elections, what to think? Well, Modi's just going to win, right? Isn't that sort of the consensus? Isn't that the Isn't that sort of the expectation? I went through maybe half of an interesting set of commentary in The Economist. The Economist did one of their periodic special reports on the Indian economy, and I was most interested to see like the Indian financial sector seems to be like the biggest success over the past 20 years. Now, financialization is can be a very, very bad thing, but a certain level of financialization can be a very good thing. And it does seem like over the past decade specifically, India has put together a lot of like basic elements of like, oh, you can actually fund some infrastructure now with Indian money, with Indian investment. You don't have to go to the World Bank or the IMF or the United States or Europe. And it really is. So India, I think if your expectations of India are China in the 2000s, you're always going to be disappointed. But I think people go way too far in the other direction, and they're like, oh, India is like Brazil, the country of the future, and it always will be. That is inaccurate. Just somebody who's bought India ETF 5-10 years ago and have been pleased with the results. It is a country that is making extraordinary strides, and even if its economic and societal rise is just on the same rate as, say, the United States or Europe's, instead of China's absolutely insane change, then like it massively changes the world. India is already massively changing the world. Just the fact that it exists sort of, I think, I don't really believe that any country other than the United States is actually sovereign in any real sense. I'd say like China's number 2, has the most elements of sovereignty behind that. And India's probably number 3, just because of its extraordinary size and the ability. I argue that really the war with Russia started in 2017 with CAATSA sanctions, when the United States decided to try and destroy its arms industry. And so we started sanctioning all kinds of countries that bought weapons from Russia, except for India. We just couldn't do it because that was India. And India is quite openly been keeping Russia afloat by buying all its oil. And the United States is sort of like, not much we can do about it. And I think probably that's actually probably an element of Modi's rampage through re-election. The Congress Party is kind of a joke. I do not like Modi. I think that I've looked into his past enough to be like, oh yeah, this guy, believes really nasty things and has done really nasty things and is apparently, I haven't read the transcript or anything, but according to people I mostly trust, is still saying really nasty things in his speeches. But goddamn, the Congress Party, like it's run by a white dude? Like, huh? Like what? Like it's like it's a half Italian guy. Is the head of the Congress Party in a country where nationalism is extraordinarily important? Like, what are they even doing? So yeah, I think Modi has been not as successful as advertised, of course, because what he was promising, was it like 10 years ago at this point, was the moon. But I think very real and very justified disgust with a lot of his political positioning, at least his rhetorical treatment of Muslims. God, I really got to look into what happened to all those Assam people he made stateless. But I think that a lot of justified Western intellectual disgust with what aspects of Modi's approach have caused us to sort of sleep on like how slowly successful he's been in, I guess, not really getting in the way of India's rise. I'm always very suspicious of people who are like, I did this. I remember, like, when I was a rabid Republican, I'd be like, oh, well, Clinton's economic success was all because of Reagan. And I think that's kind of a silly bit of political argumentation. Modi's been there for a decade. The Indian economy is doing pretty interestingly well. It's not China level. It's never going to be China level. Sorry, I don't mean it's never going to be as big as the Chinese economy. It just might take 80 years to get there, not 10 years to get there. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on the Indian election. Why exactly do you think there will be a next Arab Spring? Oil prices. Oil prices. This has been like at the root of my analysis of a bunch of things since for a while. It's oil prices. Even before the electric, I thought when I started talking about how oil prices were going to be lower for longer in like 2016 or so, I wasn't even thinking about EV stuff. I was just thinking about the incredible scale of oil exploration and production. Like it just with the suite of technologies we have right now, we haven't really tried fracking anywhere else other than the United States. Like that's kind of extraordinary to me. And Peter Zan would be like, "Oh, you can only frack in the United States," and that's horseshit. People other than the United States can do things. I understand there are some geological differences, but yeah, it's probably like applying some thought for a year or 5, and those geological differences are less of an issue. It is a broad suite of technologies, fracking, that some parts won't work in other geologies, but some parts definitely will work in other geologies. And it's been about a decade now where most of the countries that traditionally have oil resources have been less and less interested in looking for volume. Like even before the electric EVs became a factor, which are a growing and serious factor, it's been pretty clear to me that we just had way more oil than we needed. And if you just look at the prices, as we did at the beginning of this presentation, like it's just like it's just the way it is. Like there's just the prices are just way lower than they were, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who have already changed their behavior, as I discussed in this presentation, just don't have the money to maintain this very uncomfortable, very unpleasant status quo in the region for very much longer. So, Ali Rasi, thank you so much for your super chat. Do you have a question though? Ali Rasi, can Houthis actually stop the ships going to Israel from Indian Ocean? Well, so Houthis don't actually have to physically stop the ships going to Israel from the Indian Ocean. They just have to present a plausible threat that they're going to throw missiles at them. I think to date they've sunk like 1 ship or something. All they have to do is present the threat, and a ship owner is going to be like, well, I can go through Red Sea and maybe lose everything, or maybe lose my insurance, which I need for the whole ship, for the whole trip, or I can add 10 days. So they add 10 days. So it's not a question of like physically stopping, doing what they're doing. Like even the Somali pirates were bad for the Red Sea, and they were operating at a much, much lower level. So yeah, I think they, to a large extent, they already kind of have stopped. Not all of them, but a lot of them. But yeah, most ships are going around because of insurance costs, says pseudoscientist. Is Mexico the only Latin American country that managed to industrialize? I mean, Brazil has Embraer. I mean, they have a plane company, which is like the sort of the high gold. I mean, China's still trying to put that together, but Brazil sells planes all over the world. So yeah, Brazil is industrialized. I think a wide range of Latin American countries certainly have industry that is functioning. The degree to which they are industrialized is, of course, a more complicated question. Opinion on the Drake and Kendrick beef, and if any. My opinion would be I really liked the Macklemore diss track that came out. You should look for that. Macklemore put out had an intervention on the Drake-Kendrick beef that entirely describes my take on it. So yeah, you should definitely look for the Macklemore take on the Drake-Kendrick beef. Turkey and Iran, who have the better standing among Arab population? Well, Turkey for sure. Well, that's an interesting question. No, I would say Turkey. I think that the extent to which Arab republics are nervous about Iran versus like Arab governments being nervous about Iran can be overstated. Like, but I think there are probably elements of the Arab public that are kind of like, I don't really like what Iran's doing here, especially and propping up Assad. I was reading an article that was talking about that. Like, Assad is a bad dude, and a lot of the Arab reading public really wanted him to go, and Iran propped him up. That's a lot less attractive than Turkey's general approach, which has been, I mean, the government that Turkey saved was the internationally approved government of Libya. Of course, Turkey is now more or less invading Syria. Do seem to be more killing Kurds than they're killing Arabs. So yeah, it's an interesting question, but I would say that probably because of the Assad thing, Turkey, and because of Turkey has an ability. It's interesting. Iran is obviously much more strongly opposing Israel on a wide range of fronts, and has been for like decades now. Axis of resistance, Hezbollah, actual bombing recently. But what Erdogan gets to do, this is a country that up until last week had billions of dollars of trade with Israel. But what Erdogan gets to do, in part because of those billions of dollars of trade, is go to international talking shops and stand in front of a bunch of European and American people and humiliate Israel. And people love that in the Arab world. So even though Iran is a vastly more serious opponent of Israel, always has been, the fact that Erdogan can go and humiliate Netanyahu occasionally in person, that's really attractive in the Arab world. So yeah, I would say Turkey's more popular in the Arab world than Iran, but I could be wrong about that. If America stopped oil exports, oil price would go up to $100 a barrel and go down to $50 a barrel in the United States. Maybe actually, yeah, that could happen. It's not quite that straightforward. We're not exporting that much oil yet. We are exporting a ton of natural gas. Are we still net importers of oil? I'm not entirely certain, because we use a lot of oil. And also a lot of that consumption is, I guess if you're talking about NAFTA, because Canada and Mexico and the United States are all intertwined through refinery networks and pipelines and this, that, and the other thing in ways that are extraordinarily complicated. Ricey Doctor says, ever hear of Embraer? Didn't I just mention Embraer? The plane company, right? If America stopped oil exports, okay. No more super chats, huh? That's cool, I guess. Opinion on the recent B of A strike, like Bank of America? I don't know anything when you're talking about that. Plantman says, nearshoring is such a joke. How about America produces its own things instead of cheaping out on Honduras or Mexico? I disagree. I couldn't disagree with that more. I think that it is another sort of riff on this is, oh, look, sure, U.S.-Mexico trade has gone up a ton, but it's all China shipping stuff to Mexico to get to the United States. It's like, no, man, nearshoring is freaking brilliant. It is, and it's an incredible imposition on China. Even if it were true that they were just, clicking one thing onto one thing in Mexico and then shipping it to the U.S., it is China forced to make Mexico richer. It's magical. Are you kidding me? If you care about the border, which people who are spouting off in this way typically tend to, you want a richer Mexico. You want a richer Central America. So it's awesome that we are putting more jobs. I mean, God, Honduras? Yes. For the love of God, yes. It would be nice if Honduras had some jobs. It's one of the, I think Haiti has finally fully surpassed them as the poorest country in the hemisphere. But yeah, if you want less immigration at the U.S. border, then you want Honduras and Mexico to be built up. And just generally, yeah, nearshoring's amazing. We are making China make Vietnam and Mexico richer. It's a brilliant success on any level. So yeah, no, I have very little patience for opposition to nearshoring. I think it's a great idea. And like even beyond like sort of U.S. geopolitical issues, like it's kind of I mean, Vietnam and Mexico were already rising before Trump and Biden's war against Chinese trade, simply because China stopped being the low price producer. Mexico finally started getting the benefits because you could pay a Mexican when you factored in oil prices and distance. You could pay a Mexican less than you could pay a Chinese person, and this was already true in like 2015, or was getting to be true in 2015, and it's much truer now. So yeah, no, I think it's great. This is actually how it should work. You know, China isn't the low cost place anymore, so now they build more stuff in Bangladesh and Vietnam and Mexico, and you know, depending on what you think Taiwan is, and the United States. So. The oil we import is high sulfur. The oil we export is sweet, says Jack Hawkins. It's just a fun sentence there. Never brought up China. Why would I bring up China? James Parker, $10. The U.S. is a net importer of crude oil. The idea that we're a net exporter comes from lumping all petroleum products together, including natural gas. We are also a refining hub to some extent. Thank you, James Parker, and thank you for that generous super chat as a Patreon as well. Good to hear from you, James. I'm sort of a bit surprised. Oh God, are we still looking at my? No, we're looking at me. We're not looking at the graph anymore. This is so far behind. It's like 2 or 3 minutes behind. Huh. Sad. Anyway, yeah, James, thank you for the. U.S. is a net importer of crude oil. The idea that we're a net exporter comes from lumping all petroleum products together. This is true. There's very little for me to talk about here. U.S. is a net importer of crude oil, and also like it's sort of an interesting dynamic here is just how interweaved we are with Mexico and Canada. Like, you know, Mexico's sending stuff to get refined here. We're sending stuff back to them, and then Mexico's got refineries and Canada's got refineries, and it's all very complex. I think there's even without the petroleum products issue that James correctly points to, like it is a huge question whether it is a huge oversimplification to just look at how much we pump, how much we export, how much we, like as Jack was pointing out earlier, there's distinctions between kinds of oil, there's distinctions between kinds of natural gas. Petroleum products, I mean, that can also include like plastic bottles, right, James? This is all a lot more complex than this really straightforward, like, a lot of the rhetoric around it can be. I am definitely fading a little bit. I've been doing this for an hour and 50 minutes. But that's okay. I'm excited to be here. And I'll keep being here as long as there are super chats to keep me going. Southern Mexico is not that far from Central America in socioeconomical issues. No, that's incorrect. Arnado Canales Rojas. Yes. I mean, like, there's kind of a bit of an apocalypse going on in Guatemala. Like, I mean, you can probably find regions where you can, you know, say, do comparisons, this, that, and the other thing. But broadly, I mean, southern Mexico includes Mexico City and Guadalajara. And it also includes, yes, some great areas of agricultural deprivation. But, like, I do think it overstates things a lot to say that southern Mexico is not that far from Central America in socioeconomical issues. That is, I don't think that's true. Yes, northern Mexico, well, I'm not even sure that's true either. I mean, Monterrey, certainly the heightened industrialization of northern Mexico has probably led to more regional differences. But, I mean, there's also pretty poor areas in northern Mexico as well, right? So, yeah. How can, Logan Cool Extreme asks, how can Britain unfuck itself from its near perpetual clown show of a government? I don't know. Get rid of ditch the conservatives? I mean, good God. It's amazing to me that they're still in power. Like, when was Gordon Brown voted out? Like a decade ago? Like, it's amazing. But I guess it's because Labour is also an extraordinary clown show. Yeah, I don't know. And honestly, Logan, I don't pay that much attention to the UK anymore. Because who cares?
It's sort of it is a has-been of a country, and leaving the EU made it much more of a has-been of a country. Obviously, I mean, I wrote a book about the British Empire. I will always have an interest in British history and how it continues to evolve. But I got to say, in day-to-day relevance, like, UK doesn't have much. So. Will the U.S. ever remove sanctions on Russian oil and gas? Fuad asks. That's a great question, and I'd say probably not. Right? Kind of hard to see how or why we would.
Like, I mean, to be clear, like the sanctions we have now are like this weird like price cap or something along those lines. So yeah, I don't know. So that's not full sanctions of the sorts that we're more used to. But Plantman says, I'm beginning to feel like Rob doesn't know anything about Latin America. I mean, I don't cover it much. Doesn't know anything about Latin America? That makes me sad. I mean, it's certainly not something I've covered as deeply as I've covered Europe or the Middle East, but I think I know a little bit about Latin America. Rob's a fool that doesn't know what he's talking about. Plant man, you're being mean. I think you're wrong about the UK, says Kizan. Why am I wrong about the UK? What about Indonesian influence on current Gaza invasion due to them being the biggest Muslim country? I'm a little surprised at how little there's been. I think it's underreported, but I think in Malaysia and Indonesia there's been fairly serious like boycott and divestment actions. I'm not sure if it's on the government level, but certainly privately, and I wouldn't be surprised. I need to read up on it more. But yeah, I mean, years ago I talked about how Indonesia and Turkey were taking away leadership of the Islamic world from Saudi Arabia, and yeah, that I haven't seen that dynamic much, but I think things are changing in really serious ways now. Actually, I think that the Indonesian and Malaysian publics are irate about what Israel is doing in Gaza, and I know that there have been. I've read a little bit about some of the impacts of that, but I don't know what I can't speak to it at great length. James Cook says he does know about Latin America. Mexican here. Thank you, James Cook. I appreciate that. It's very kind. The Primal Fuckhead has always just had one of my favorite names. What's your knowledge on the complexities that be involved in college endowment divestiture from Israel? Not high. I do know that nobody's done it yet. I think, was it Brown conceded to like, oh, we'll talk about it. I mean, like that talk about, I think it's totally doable. If I were to research this, which I have not, I think the first thing to research would be the extent to which universities have divested from fossil fuel companies. So I'm sure that's demands that they've fielded before. What does a given endowment, what is their interaction with ESG issues? What kind of fossil fuel divestment have they done? My expectation is not much. I think that endowments are intentionally, as part of the infrastructure of these things, are set up as sort of separate things with professional managers that absolutely do eventually have to do what the university governance structure wants, but it's not like the student government. It's like the trustees who probably deal with a range of boards who might have an advisory committee that they nominate people to that oversee the professional managers. So you'd have to have not a student protest, but you'd have to have like the president of the university, the faculty, and the trustees, and whatever other appropriated boards are, all be completely unified in telling their professional managers that they had to divest from Israel. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not even saying it's unlikely over the course of the next decade, considering how Israel's been comporting itself. But it's tremendously more difficult. Like the idea that like you were going to have an encampment and have Colombia divested from Israel before the finals were over was never a possibility. I don't even think any of the student activists thought that was a possibility. But no, it's very difficult, but it's not impossible, and it'll take a lot to be done. Yeah, Balkan says, I've seen Indonesia in the news about Israel boycott. Yeah, I need to look into that more. Which do you have less confidence to talk about, Latin America or Africa? Africa. Well, it depends on the African country. Like I now feel, I've honestly been falling away from it a little bit, but I do feel in prior years I've done a lot of research on Tunisia. I've got a series of 6 or 7 videos out on Tunisian democracy. I've had moments of intense engagement with Libya until I get sick of it. I think I got pretty up on Ethiopia. I mean, just better than most U.S. news sources. A couple years back. Sudan I've been paying a lot of attention to. But yeah, you get, as my Niger podcast has indicated to some people, I did not do such a great job. But yeah, you get into sort of the less populous and poorer countries of the Sahel. I don't know. I mean, I know very little about Nigeria, embarrassingly little about Nigeria, embarrassingly little about the Congo, embarrassingly little. Basically, yeah, under the Sahara, things get pretty bad for me on Africa. Latin America, I think, again, it's sort of certain countries. I feel like I've engaged with Mexican history a lot, and like have some grasp of it. The rest of it, not so much, but probably better and more, because of things like Venezuela and Bolivia and, a couple long books I've read on the regions entirely, long podcasts I've engaged with. I'd say I know more about Latin America than I do about Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. So yeah, what about the Maghreb? I think I'm pretty good on. Well, I think I'm okay on the Maghreb, but I'm not as current as I used to be. Eskidin Aidi asks, what WTF does divestiture mean? And I think what we're talking about is BDS, boycott, divestiture, and sanctions. It's essentially getting U.S. universities. So universities have endowments, which are extraordinarily large sums of money, some of which they were given hundreds of years ago. That's an interesting question. It's like some of them actually might go back to slave. I don't think any of the actual endowments go back to slave money, but they certainly go back to the Gilded Age, in like Harvard or Yale's case. So it's an endowment is basically somebody decades ago put together an incredibly large sum of money that is not to be used. It's just to be invested for the benefit of the university. The large universities in the United States famously have endowments that are larger than the GDPs of most African countries. So Harvard's got like, I don't know, $50 billion or hundreds of billions of dollars or something like that. So one of the demands of the student protesters in the United States is for divestiture, which is essentially saying that Columbia University endowment has to take all its money out of companies that work with Israel. So that's what divestiture means. Aditya Mohan asks, why are U.S. universities such a mess right now? Also, do you think this could trigger a Vietnam-style anti-war movement against Israel? I think we've already got a Vietnam-style anti-war movement against Israel. The important question is it going to be on the same scale, and is it going to be sustainable? I would say the answer to both of those, probably not. I do think, well, I am not someone, and I have been saying for a while, I don't think this Israel thing is going to stop this year. I think probably it'll keep going until the election, until Netanyahu kicks out Biden. But I don't think it's going to be to the extent of the Vietnam War. Like, I don't think it's going to be that. Like, and that was a years-long engagement. I think that Israel is going to eventually stop bombing Gaza. They're going to keep occupying it, probably. But I think that when Israel backs off, I expect the fever pitch of protest to fall down a bit. And I haven't really seen anything about like what happens after finals. Like the way the academic year is structured in the United States is, I mean, my university, I think it was mid-April. Michigan, has already had its commencement. Like a lot of these people are graduating, and a lot of people are going off to summer internships. It's kind of a different. It's a different world from like the 1970s, where these guys could be like, oh, what are you gonna do this summer? I'll go focus on political activism, and we're gonna do a march on Washington. Where even sometimes, in some cases, especially at these elite institutions, the pressure for even, really politically motivated kids is to go get that job, go get that. That's why it's been so much of a news
event over the past weeks of, mostly right-wing losers, but, probably people who aren't announcing it beyond the right-wing losers, essentially saying, we're not going to employ anybody from Colombia anymore. So what a lot of these student activists are going to have to do to continue on the path that they're on is go get prestigious internships this summer. And if they're going to be doing prestigious internships, they're not going to be organizing a march on Washington. So it remains to be seen. But I think a really undercovered aspect of all of these campuses is that 2 weeks from now, there aren't going to be any students on them, or it's going to be summer classes or whatever. So I think that's a dynamic that maybe people should pay a little more attention to. And who knows, Rafah could be a horrific ongoing thing that just fills the news more and more and more. Honestly, fewer student protests might give a little more oxygen to coverage of what Israel's doing in Gaza, frankly, or maybe not. I don't know. So I do feel like I'm being a bit of a stick in the mud and being sort of dismissive of these Zoomers or something or whatnot. But I'm not seeing many dynamics that make me think that we're in a Vietnam level issue.
Okay, we are at. Thank you. Oh, it's only $50 billion. Piff, nothing. Bren Johnson says the Harvard University endowment valued at 49. Do you think UK society still lead themselves as the big boy at the table? Yes, they're wrong. Commander Red messaged you on Instagram with potential topics of discussion for podcast. Commander Red, do you have a podcast? Show me. I need examples of former episodes of your podcast, and then I will make a decision whether I would come on. You should leave him alone. You can't just be sending him stuff on Instagram. He needs some personal time, lol. Well, thank you, Plan Man. It's a nice thing for you to say after saying such bad things about me earlier. The stream cut out for people? That's sad. But we are kind of at the end of the time anyway. Are there no more super chats? Nobody else has anything to keep me going? What are your thoughts about the BCCI bank scandal? The 90s, man. I haven't thought about that. Is that Riggs Bank? I haven't thought about that in years. Something I should definitely read up on. What are your thoughts about the BCCI bank scandal? All right. Well, it has been 2 solid hours. This has been great. I think we had almost 200 people here at one point. That's a pretty good group of folks. I'm shocked by just how I feel like the delay is higher than it has been. Let's see. Super chats do prolong the chat, folks, but I think we're probably towards the end anyway. Have you ever considered to be a diplomat? Well, I don't think. The problem is I love my country and would like to serve it, but I think the problem is there's actually not much interest in employing people in the U.S. government who know things. At some point, the United States will stop being so immensely powerful that we don't have to know anything or do anything intelligent. But I don't think that's going to be my lifetime. So we're probably just going to keep being powerful enough to not have to learn anything or do anything intelligent. So, yeah. I'm definitely lagging more. Oh, that's a pity. But I think we're done. Anyway, thanks so much. No data. Jesus. Okay. End stream.